The thing that is often misunderstood is how if you move too quickly with sex, or what I should say is if you move without really being connected, then you miss the sensation. And when you miss the sensation, what do you have other than frustration and numbness? So I also want to emphasize, whether you had sex last night or 10 years ago, that the most important thing to focus on to enjoy more pleasure is arousal. So you can learn to arouse one another and prolong arousal and get to where neither one of you can wait any longer to have sex. That's when you're ripe to do it again, no matter how long it's been since the last time.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Sexology Podcast. I am so excited to welcome Dr. Alexandra Stockwell, MD. Dr. Alexandra, welcome to our show.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. I love the name of your show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very excited about this conversation. So today we're going to talk about couples who are kind of like, for some reason, they're not sexually as connected or in tune. And it's a topic that often elicits so much reaction from people. Few years ago, I had this video on YouTube. I talked about sexless marriage, and I got like close to 1 million views, and people are just like so passionate about it, which is understandable because it's just hard to justify living in a relationship if you want sex and sex is not available, or you feel disconnected with your partner. I know we both see people who are in a sexless relationship. So can you share with us what are some of the signs that you see that people are moving potentially to that direction?
Okay, well, this is such an important question. I love how you frame that. And I want to zoom way out and talk about uncompromising intimacy, which is the name of my book, is the name of my method. And really, that's rooted in the reality that far and away the most common relationship advice that is given is that you need to compromise. If you want to be happy in marriage, you have to be excellent at compromising. And the fact is that that is completely wrong. If you want a bland, pleasant companionship, maybe sexless marriage, maybe, some obligatory sex from time to time, compromise is a great way to create that kind of pleasant, bland relationship. But if you want an erotically alive, sexually fulfilling, really dynamic relationship, then I advocate for what I call uncompromising intimacy. And when I use the word uncompromising, I don't mean that you always get your own way. It's not about being rigid and it has to be that does not make for a good relationship either. However, when I think of compromise, I think of withholding who I am, my desires, my challenges, important things in my internal world, withholding them so that my partner is more comfortable. So when it comes to uncompromising intimacy, it's about learning to share really the truth of who you are, what you want, what you don't want, what your fears are, in a way that your partner can receive it and ideally shares the same. So getting back to your question about some signs of the sexless marriage, yes, of course, sometimes there are medical conditions or physical conditions or psychological conditions that contribute to the sexless marriage. But far and away, what is much more common is an erosion in whether or not someone can be themselves with their partner. Emotionally, in terms of communication, and that always also trickles down into sexuality, because we are not creatures who can behave one way in the day-to-day and then find some magic switch that flips in order to be fully expressed, fully present, comfortable in the bedroom. So for me, one of the biggest signs of kind of a precursor to the sexless marriage, is feeling uncomfortable sharing something that's important. Not that you need to share everything with your partner, then we'd never get anything else done. But if there's something you feel you just can't say because the culture of your marriage doesn't permit it or it won't be accepted, if that's how you feel, then probably you're in a sexless marriage, or you're likely to be if you don't become more comfortable being self-expressed. So there's more to it, but that's my initial long answer.
I appreciate it. First of all, for our listeners, sometimes when people think about sexless relationship, they think about, oh, there's absolutely no sex. Like, I know that research is different. Usually people say about 10 times per year when, for example, you want sex and continuously you feel disappointed. And you brought up such a great point when you talked about this idea of compromise. Compromise can be good at time. I know that sometimes when we have too much rigidity, that also gets in the way. But we don't have a good script around what is a hot, sexy relationship long term, right? What we see, we know how romantically it could look like. Like in families, we don't see the passionate, kind of like marriages, passionate relationship. So we get this idea of we have to force ourselves to make ourselves available, as you talked about, kind of feeling like sex as a chore, right? That I want to keep my relationship. I'm not feeling sexual. I'm not connected to my eroticism, to you, kind of connected to you. But now I know it's good for my relationship. Therefore, here we are. And the other partner that's in the receiver, they also can feel it, right? Like people, what they really like is like this delicious back and forth between the partners and building of arousal. And when you're not into it, that can also feel like a form of rejection. I know many people come to me and they say, like, I hate it when I ask my partner, but I felt I forced them. And that's not where I want to be. I like that you're talking about this possibility of connecting with your partner, showing up yourself. That when you show the raw parts of you, that's also can be very sexy. And I think long-term relationship, many people fall into this sibling role. Like they know all about their partner, but they're just not sexual partner anymore. Like it's just uncomfortable for them to talk about sex. The same way you don't want to talk about sex with your sibling in a way, right? Like you just thought you're not bringing your erotic stuff in that context. Sometimes people have that discomfort. So it's not necessarily that they lost their desires at times. It's just like I don't feel I'm erotically available in this relationship. What do you think about those cases that people are more like siblings?
You know, you bring to mind something that is so important. Most things in life, the more we do them, the more masterful we become. You know, the first time you bake a cake and the 50th time you bake a cake, that cake is just, you're going to make it more quickly. It's going to be more delicious. I could give countless examples where repetition creates skill. And so it's very confronting why that would not be the case in long-term relationships. And as you've said, I also want to emphasize, like, everything that I'm saying is specifically in the context of long-term relationships. You can have a one-night stand and not know anything about your partner, and it can be fantastic. It won't necessarily be, but it can be. So yes, what we're really talking about is sex with the same person again and again, how to not have it be bland. And so one thing definitely, it's what you said, which is talking about the sex you're having. And I want to emphasize that doesn't mean complaining about the sex you're having. It doesn't mean being critical of your partner's shortcomings or feeling fed up with your own. You can start talking about sex, have that become part of your regular communication by talking about moments you enjoyed, even if they were years ago. Just, it's kind of arousing to have a discussion about a wonderful sexual moment together. Even if you long to have it again and it's been a while, that's still a better place to start than criticizing what has been happening. But really, what I want to respond to in the question about couples who are like siblings is to talk about what to do about it. Because anyone listening to a podcast called the Sexology Podcast wants more fulfilling sex. And really, that's the other thing when it comes to sexless marriages. It's not even about how often you're having sex. It's about how fulfilling the sex is that you are having. And yes, there are all kinds of things we can do in the bedroom to make a difference. But because in a long-term relationship, we're interacting so much in the day-to-day, I encourage couples to start outside of the bedroom in order to heat up the bedroom, mostly with curiosity. Because if you think back to the feeling of being in love, the honeymoon phase, just it's wonderful with your partner. That phase is fully permeated with curiosity. We want to know, where is that tattoo from? What was your second grade teacher's name? What's your favorite food? Where would you like to travel? I mean, anything whimsical or profound. We're just filled with curiosity. And then we move on to a wonderful part of a relationship where we feel comfortable with one another. Yes, we know one another so well. You may even think you can predict what your partner's going to say whenever some topic comes up. And the main thing that I want to convey is that we get to feel secure, comfortable, stable, and enjoy the richness and steadiness of a long-term relationship without sacrificing curiosity. Because as human beings, we are constantly growing. And the real question is, do you include the growth and evolution and internal exploration in your relationship? Or is that something that has to be left at the door when you come home and interact with one another again? So I've had couples where, especially when the woman is my client and hasn't told her husband that she's coaching. And so things need to be done very discreetly. That's not my ideal situation. I'm very open to it. I much prefer to coach couples where they're both enthusiastic about learning how to improve their marriage. But anyway, it certainly happens often that isn't the case. And so I'm thinking right now of one client, and she bought, there's many different card decks available online with just different questions, whimsical questions, profound. Maybe these days we wouldn't go in the political direction, but just like, what's your, if you could have dinner with a celebrity, alive or dead, who would it be and what would you want to ask them? I mean, questions that probably you've never discussed before. And so this client had a deck of these cards in the kitchen in the silverware drawer, and she used to just pick a question or two and just have it with her at dinner without ever telling her husband. And so she started asking questions that he'd never been asked, and then he would ask her, and it just brought back some spark. And it seems so minimal compared to a passionate, erotically alive relationship, but don't knock it until you've tried it. I once gave a talk in which I included this, and there was a woman in the audience who actually was there for the talk after mine. She had been married for 32 years. She had a very good marriage. She didn't need any help, but she sat down to listen just because I was talking. And so she heard this, and she messaged me the next day because she went home and I had given a number of suggestions for questions, and she asked her husband, and they had one of the most connected conversations they had in years, and went on to make love with a tenderness that she said it hadn't been there in ages. And all they really did was be more curious about what's alive inside one another. So I really think the best way out of feeling like roommates or siblings is to become fascinated by your partner. What was a highlight in your week last week? There's no way you would know that unless there was some like huge milestone. But like in a regular day-to-day phase of life, what was most challenging? What's something you learned about yourself this past week? These really are the seasonings that kind of lubricate the path to evolving out of a roommate sibling feeling into more passion. Because if you can do that outside the bedroom, it's not so difficult to do that inside the bedroom or wherever you happen to have sex.
I love that. And I appreciate this concept of curiosity a lot. I think it's helpful in so many different levels. First, like very obvious layer is like making your partner feel seen. I
Mm.
heard from so many couples that they live together, they feel like my partner is not seeing me. I come back from work, we're just talking about kids, we're in front of TV, and they have this yearning of like being seen and they being validated in a way. So I appreciate when you're kind of asking these thoughtful questions, you're showing interest, and also you might get surprised to learn about part of your partner that's kind of unknown to you, and that is often where eroticism at times lies. I know that we, like my husband and I, like a few weeks ago, I get a lot of things. I can imagine that's a case for you because we're in this field, and we were doing this cards. That's one of the
Hmm.
colleagues said, and like we talk about sex all the time. But even with that, I was like talking about like, was it like what part of your body is hottest for you? And I was talking about this, and my husband said, "Oh my God, I didn't know about few of these." Right. And we had this open conversation. And now, whenever we make love and we have sex, and that's also is added, which is like fun and playful. And I think the other component is that our everything in life evolves, right? We don't often like the same wine we liked when we were 18 or 19. Hopefully, you're not drinking at 19, maybe like 21, or food. And sex is the same. Our taste evolves. But if we're going with the same routine that we were using when it comes to sex, like many years ago, then right now, then we might not want to have the same thing. And that kind of makes sex uh, not as interesting. I think you brought up such a great point when you talked about the why is it that like after so many times that we have sex, like hundreds and hundreds of times with our partner, then we are getting worse at it. And I think part of it is like lack of kind of like being in the moment and updating the script.
Yeah. And I want to add something. So I've now been married 29 years. I have 4 children. I have a full life. And it was wonderful to realize that I'm not interested in having the sex I was having when I was 25 years old or 30. I think very often, especially for men and women who transition into midlife, whether you think that's 40 or 50 or 60, whenever you think of it, that it's like people often have the idea that the prime has passed. And that's probably true. Well, it's not, but the way I was going to finish that sentence is that it's not about the age, but there's something about the early part of relationship when you're doing new positions and having sex in new locations, like the adventure and the not knowing how it's going to go exactly is definitely a very important, intriguing part of what makes it erotically fulfilling. But the real benefit of sex with the same person for decades is in how familiar you are with one another. And what I would say from my personal experience is that it's the huge level of attunement that my husband and I have with one another as a result of being so familiar with one another's bodies and our sexual routines that when we bring more intentionality and attention, it's really a very nuanced micro adjustment that opens up all this new sensation. So if someone were filming us, which they are never doing, just to be clear, but if someone were filming us, it might look like what we're doing is the same thing we've done, as you say, hundreds of times before. But because of the quality of our tension and the micro adjustment in one or both of our bodies, it just opens up literally a whole new reservoir of sensation and pleasure that we never could have accessed if we weren't in a way, slow with our attention. It doesn't mean we're moving slowly. Sometimes this can happen with faster movements, but it feels more like slow and mindful and intentional rather than adventurous and acrobatic. I'm not at all against adventure or acrobatics, but that's not often where, after decades, the pleasure expands.
I agree with you. The trust that you can have with your partner and the kind of like openness you feel inside, I think that also can contribute with deepening of the pleasure. And hopefully that's paired with communication. Because I have so many couples they coming in married for several decades, but they barely talk about sex outside the bedroom. And it's hard to update the script that you have unless you're talking about it. One thing that I see a lot, one kind of like pattern in my practice is that couples are disconnected sexually for a few years or even more than a decade, and they want to connect, but they don't know if it's possible to connect with the partner. I'm kind of curious, is that something that you see and you think what shift needs to happen for people, whether it's physically or emotionally, to be able to reconnect if you haven't had sex for a while?
Well, in my personal practice, the longest time a couple had not had sex and then sought my expertise was 11 years. And they went on to make love in ways that for most of those 11 years they never thought would be possible. And I think I really cannot emphasize enough in that scenario, and honestly, whether it's 6 months or 11 years, it's kind of the same difference. And so as a kind of likely time when this happens, it's the postpartum phase. But really, anytime there's been a long time since the last time of sex, start slowly and let go of goals. The measure of success is not ejaculation, both of you having an orgasm. The measure of success is both of you relaxing and connecting enough, feel the erotic energies flow. So maybe if a couple hasn't had sex in a while, again, whether it's postpartum or any other reason, to just start by lying in bed together naked. Maybe put on some music and just lie together. And that's enough for the first time. I think the thing that is often misunderstood is how if you move too quickly with sex, or what I should say is if you move without really being connected, then you miss the sensation. And when you miss the sensation, what do you have other than frustration and numbness? So I also want to emphasize, whether you had sex last night or 10 years ago, that the most important thing to focus on to enjoy more pleasure is arousal. So you can learn to arouse one another and prolong arousal and get to where neither one of you can wait any longer to have sex. That's when you're ripe to do it again, no matter how long it's been since the last time. So lots of communication, lots of quiet, lots of touch, and checking in with one another afterwards. Not necessarily, maybe during, if that feels right for the two of you, but I'm also really a big fan of when you're going to do something new or something you haven't done for a long time in the sexual realm, to have a conversation when you're both calm, you're both dressed, maybe even not even in the bedroom, so that you can just be more mature and present, and it's a less confronting conversation. And again, afterwards, it's very important, if you've had a conversation and then you try together, to assess and make adjustments for the future. And so once you've done this a while, sure, you can lay in bed and have the conversation. But if this is all new, then not right after you finish having sex or hugging one another, whatever it may be, but maybe the next day, again, when you're fully dressed, maybe it's over breakfast and a cup of coffee. It's like, how was that for you? What would you like to do similarly? And what would you like to do differently the next time? I think it's really important, like, and I know the data is there's very little data about how to really maintain passion in a long-term marriage. But the one piece of data that's very clear is having conversations with your partner about the sex you're having. And so I apply what I've just said to start having those conversations really separate from sex, and have your review and reflection also separate from having sex. And that will make those conversations more comfortable and make their value much higher the next time you're touching one another.
It's such a great advice to slowly try to reintroduce kind of eroticism or pleasure and build arousal. What I often notice for couples that I work with is that there's something happens, right? In long-term relationship, something happens that you stop having sex or stop having quality sexual experiences. But oftentimes, instead of addressing what was happening, then now we're in this cycle of like trying to force, like having sex, not force like a rape kind of form, but like forcing ourselves or pressuring our partner want to have sex, and then get to this cycle of like pursuer and distancer, and just like we're living in this dynamic or resignation, both parties. But when we are at this place of slowly trying to reconnect, we can see what shows up in between, what gets in the way. Like it's just slowly, like pausing the movie in a way, right? Or seeing, okay, what's happening here? And there are at times stories that we haven't paid attention. Maybe it's grief, maybe it's anger. I have clients that they say like, my partner, the way they talk to me even 5 years ago, like right after work, this is what they said. And it's just like, since then, I couldn't see them in the same light. Or it could be, they had an affair, and then now I cannot let it go. Like he apologized, she apologizes, but like I'm not at a place of letting go. I guess what I'm curious about, what do you think about? Do you think we should address the issue first and reintroduce the connection, or reestablish the connection and then kind of like address the underlying pattern that got in the way?
This is such a good question. And I think the sort of societal conventional response is that men like to have sex in order to connect, and women like to connect in order to have sex, and so nothing happens. I don't think it's quite that simple. And really, our bodies kind of have their own wisdom, their own preferences. So there are plenty of times where someone with their mind can be like, no, this isn't right. He hasn't apologized yet. She hasn't, whatever it is. And so with our minds, we can be sure this shouldn't happen. But meanwhile, he's getting hard, she's getting wet, and our bodies are singing another tune. And when that happens, I think the most courageous and adventurous and erotically exciting thing is to let our bodies lead. But similarly, in the way that you were just talking, we can people override their bodies when our bodies are saying no, and we think we should have sex. And so we go ahead, but then it's not connecting, it's not nourishing. So in the case where both bodies are a yes, then I say, override the mind. But in the case where the bodies are saying no, I definitely don't say, override the bodies. And I'll just share a story of a couple that was kind of in this situation where I think it had been 9 months since they'd had sex when we started working together. And I had just met them, and this was actually very early in my practice. It was over 10 years ago. And so I knew they needed to build rapport with one another, rebuild, and I needed to build rapport with them. So I think we took maybe 2 sessions talking about curiosity, how to listen generously, because there's both being curious and asking the questions, and then really being interested in the answer. Like I don't advocate asking a question that you're not actually interested to know the answer, because that ends up backfiring, in terms of where you said putting attention on the partner. You want to really be doing that. So anyway, curiosity, honest answers. And one of the things that came out is that she was a very beautiful woman, but she thought he was no longer attracted to her. I think she was maybe 48 and she didn't look like she looked when she was 25. And so she thought he was no longer attracted to her, and that's why he wasn't interested in having sex. She had much more desire. He, on the other hand, actually really wanted to have sex with her, but was concerned with his own performance, potential erectile dysfunction, and just found it so, he just suffered so much when he couldn't please her that he preferred to just decline to have sex than to face the pain of not bringing her pleasure. So he was shutting down because he didn't want to disappoint her, and she had assumed he was no longer attracted to her. But neither one of them had communicated, because as things closed down in the bedroom, they closed down in communication in general. And so during these early sessions, with curiosity and honesty, they were able to really hear what was going on for one another. And with each couple and each person in a couple, like, the answers are going to be different. You cannot infer it. You have to actually ask and make room for the answer to be given. So they did this, and so maybe it was now the 3rd session or 4th, and I thought, okay, now we'll actually start talking about sex. But they were kind of a proper couple, and so I said, well, let's transition into other topics. And they both looked confused, and I was like, well, the reason you reached out to me at first. And then finally her eyes got big, and she just kind of leaned towards her husband and kind of giggled and said, oh, we're all set. Because as soon as they communicated and understood, they just transitioned seamlessly without any additional intervention from me to have very beautiful sex with one another. So in terms of your question, I guess my bottom line is our bodies lead. It's our bodies that are, sure, our souls are having sex with one another too, but it's like our bodies are the vehicle for erotic activity. And when they're a yes, you don't need to hold off and process. It's not going to accomplish anything. But if your bodies are a no, then you want to cultivate emotional intimacy and more meaningful communication, because that is going to be the most effective foreplay anyway.
I love that wisdom of kind of like leaning into your body and see like what's available there. And if we need additional intervention, because our body has its own wisdom, then we can go from there. I can talk to you for hours about all of these things. And I see that you have your wealth of great knowledge. So for our listeners that are curious about you, about your services, what are some of the places they can find you?
AlexandraStockwell.com is my website, and I think that's a really good starting place. From there, you can find my podcast, the Intimate Marriage Podcast, my book, Uncompromising Intimacy, and all my social media links and my various programs. I think the one worth mentioning in this context is the Aligned and Hot Marriage program, which it's exactly everything we've been talking about. But the starting point really is my website, AlexandraStockwell.com.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure we leave a link to it. Thank you so much for coming in the show. It was lovely to have the opportunity to learn from you.
Thank Thank you so much.